Gute Woche and Farbrengen Purim. Rabbi Zilgesensen began the Farbrengen this afternoon that today is Shabbos Zocher. And Shabbos Zocher is Achas Bashana. It's once a year. Even though every Shabbos is Achas Bashana. Every Shabbos with its Kriya is only once a year. However, there's something special in Parsha Zocher as opposed to all other Shabbosim, and not only to all the other Shabbosim of a regular Kriya, but also as opposed to, we know Zocher is one of the four Parshias. We have Shkolim, Zocher, Para, and HaChodesh. And there's something special in Parsha Zocher even regarding these other Parshias as well. And that is the fact that the obligation of Zocher, of reading Parsha Zocher on the Shabbos, is a chiyuv min ha-Torah. It's a chiyuv mid'oraisa to read this Parsha. Regarding Parshas Para, the Rebbe says, there's difference in opinions. There's some opinions that claim that Parshas Para is also min ha-Torah, but not everybody holds so. However, Parshas Zocher, everyone holds that Zocher is min ha-Torah. Here the Rebbe brings out that we have inyonim that are min ha-Torah. Then we have inyonim which we know they are mid'Rabbanan. The Chachamim have arranged these inyonim. There are certain inyonim which were arranged by Moshe Rabbeinu. However, they are not spelled out beferish in the Torah. These inyonim, the Rebbe says, have a category of a derabanan, but obviously it's stronger than a regular derabanan. And the Rebbe brought an example. What is one of these inyonim? Moshe was the one that arranged for Kriyas HaTorah on every Shabbos. So it's an inyan which is not min HaTorah. Talk to Kriyas on every Shabbos, all year round. At the same time, it is stronger than a derabanan. It's in the category of derabbanans, but it is stronger than a regular derabanan. However, Parshas Zocher is something so outstanding that it is a chiyuv min ha-Torah. The chiyuv of Zocher is Asher Asalacha. And the inyan of Zocher is something which is for all generations. We have to refer to Amalek, as the pasuk says, "Midoyer doyer." Zocher is Asher Asalacha. Mochitim chazech Amalek midoyer doyer. For any generation, meaning that even in the generation of Mashiach, we will also be referring to wiping out Amalek. So it's something which is of special significance. Mela, like every inyan in Torah, ha'maisehu ha'ika, the main thing of every inyan is that it should be brought down into deed, into action, to bring it down into a bepoyel. And this inyan, it is definitely so. This is such a strong and obvious, such an outstanding inyan, such a chashiv inyan, that this inyan in itself, it is understood that such an inyan definitely has to be brought down into Maisa. Especially when we're talking about an inyan of the battle which the Yidden had with Amalek. An inyan of a milchama. There is no bigger action than an action of milchama. Milchama in itself is a tremendous inyan of Maisa. And as we know, Chassidus tells us how important a milchama, in other words, how significant the milchama is. The Rebbe referred to the Maim of Basi Lagani, where the Frierdiker Rebbe explains that when it comes to a war, when it comes to a milchama, the king gets involved, and he takes his own treasures, and treasures she'otzlu aveisav, which his ancestors have saved and put away. And when it comes to a war, he's ready to splurge all this out and spend it all, as long as to make sure that the war is successful. So here we see how meaningful an inyan of a milchama is. Memela, when we're talking about such an inyan of Mechiyas Amalek, which is also tied in with the milchama which the Yidden had with Amalek. So Memela, it is self-understood that such an inyan definitely has to be brought down and come down into Maisa. And the Rebbe also mentioned that in the Psukim we find that Moshe put Yeshua in charge of the Milchama with Amalek. In other words, Yeshua was the disciple of Moshe. If we should use a different terminology, it's the peiros, it's the fruit of Moshe. So what does this show? That this is also something which is not only did it remain by Moshe, but it went fruit to the fruit of Moshe, which was Yeshua, Peiros, or Peiroi Peirosayen, into fruits of fruits. And as just mentioned, this is something which goes down midoyer throughout all the generations. This is a Melchama which we constantly have. And constantly we have to refer to the inyan of Mechias Amalek, of wiping out Amalek. This is a commandment which we have to do. In all generations we have to refer to this inyan of wiping out Amalek. And here the Rebbe tied this also to the inyan which was spoken last Shabbos. Especially that this Shabbos comes after Zayin Odom, which was last Sunday, which is the day, Moshe Rabbeinu's day. It's the day that Moshe Rabbeinu was born, and it is the day that Moshe Rabbeinu passed away. And it's spoken in last week's Farbrengen. The whole inyan of Moshe Rabbeinu was that he brought the Shechina down into this world. He was the one that through him the Rebishter channeled the mitzvah of Ha'osu L'Mikdash V'Shachanti B'Soicham, the fact that the Shechina should come down onto this world. And as we know, also mentioned in the Maimar Basi Legani, that who was the one that brought down the Shechina from the first heaven into Aretz Halazua Gashmis, into this Gashmistic world, it was through Moshe Rabbeinu. Because Moshe Rabbeinu was the one who got the message from the Rebishter that Yidden are commanded on Va'osu L'Mikdash V'Shachanti B'Soich. And as the Rebbe stressed last week, Pasuk uses the expression V'yikhu li Truma. Last week said the Rebishter says that the Yidden should take Truma, contribute to Truma, which is the donation for the erection of the Mishkan. So there's a Medrash, the Medrash says, Kol mokem shenemar li, wherever the expression of li is used, it's in something which expresses eternity. Einoi zaz misham, einoi zaz mim koimoi. It doesn't move from its place. It is something which is there. So the Rebbe today added on. It means that it is something which is there eternal. It doesn't move from its place. So the Rebbe today, talking in the inyan, how every Yid is capable of making his own house and his own environment a place suitable for the Shechina, which is what the Rebbe has been demanding recently, and how in the Beis HaMikdash we have all of the inyanim. We have in the Beis HaMikdash, we have a combination of Torah, Avodah, and Gemilas Chasadim. Torah we have in the Beis HaMikdash. The Oren was in the Oren which contained the Luchos. Avodah is obvious. Beis Tefillah Yekorei L'Chala Almim. It's a house of prayer. The Rebbe refers to the Beis HaMikdash. The Avodah was done in the Beis HaMikdash with Karbanis. And then we also have the inyan of Gemilas Chasadim. Here the Rebbe referred that there's a Gemara, Haroitze Lahashir Yatzpin. Mara says the one who wants to become rich, let him look towards north. Why? So the Gemara ties it in. We are told that the Shulchan, the Beis HaMikdash, was standing in the Tzafim, was standing on the north side of the Mishkan, on the north side of the Beis HaMikdash. What does this show us? It shows us that the Shulchan, which had the breads on it, and the breads remained constantly fresh from week to week, as Chazal tell us. So this brings out the idea of giving Gashmias. In other words, it's a source of Gashmias. So that's the inyan of Gemilas Chesed. So in the Beis HaMikdash we have a combination of Torah, Avodah, and Gemilas Chesed. The same thing when we're talking in the spiritual Beis HaMikdash, which everyone is capable of setting up within his own self, in his own home. And everyone, adults as well as children, as the Rebbe keeps on stressing. It's also in such a way, just like in the Beis HaMikdash, there was an excellence in Torah, Avodah, and Gemilas Chasadim, and the same way in our own spiritual Beis HaMikdash, it also has to be the same way. And today the Rebbe added on also, what is the pshat in the Medrash? Kol mokem shenem ali einoi zaz mim koimoi. It doesn't move from its place. What does it mean it doesn't move from its place? The Medrash could have said, Kol mokem shenem ali, wherever it says li, it is something eternal. Einoi zaz, it doesn't move. Why does every word in Chazal is accurate? Why do Chazal add on mim koimoi from its place? Mokoim is something which reflects Gashmias. If the Medrash would have only said, Kol mokem shenem ali einoi zaz, we could have touched it that the Mishkan is there, but it is there only in the spiritual sense. The Kedusha is there, but it is there only spiritually. The Medrash stresses further, Kol mokom shenemar li eino zos mim koimoi. It doesn't move from its place, meaning that in Gashmias, there's a Kedusha Gashmis, there's a Gashmistic Kedusha, which the Rebishter has instilled in the Beis HaMikdash, in the Mishkan. It's something which is there, being that the expression of Li is used, so this is an expression of eternity, meaning that Begashmias, this Mokum remains constantly Kodesh. And in Mela the same when we're talking about the spiritual Beis HaMikdash, the spiritual Mishkan, which everyone is capable of erecting. It's something which comes down to the extent that doesn't just remain in a spiritual sense. It remains that in the Mokem HaGashmi, in other words, it affects the Gashmis of the environment where this happens. That environment which becomes a Mishkan, the environment which becomes a spiritual Beis HaMikdash, becomes Begashmi as holy. That's the stress in the Medrash. There's a Kedusha Ruchnis, there's a special spiritual holiness in this Mokem HaGashmi, in this physical place. In the house and in the room of a child, the bed, the table, and our own houses. Everywhere where we fulfill this message of making a Bayis Kedusha, making a house of holiness, and in the way of the Beis HaMikdash, it's to such an extent that it does not move from its place. The Gashmi is the place, becomes full of Kiddush. This is regarding the union of Parsha Zohar. Today is 13 days in Adar. 13 days in Adar is the day of Tainis Esther. The only thing, being that it is Shabbos, we don't fast. So the Rebbe says, we don't fast, but on the other hand, we can't say that the spiritual inyanim of Tainis Esther we are missing because it is Shabbos. Tainis Esther has its spiritual contribution, and that is here because the Shabbos does not come chas v'sholom to take away. Shabbos comes to add on and to give more. We can't say that just because it is Shabbos and we don't fast, so all of the other inyanim, all of the other spiritual values of Tainis Esther, should we say that they don't exist? Chas v'sholom. So we must say that the spiritual values of Tainis Esther are here, though we don't fast. The Alter Rebbe explains in Likutei Torah, the Rebbe continues, that there's a concept of lahachyoisam berov, meaning lahachyoisam, to give chayes, to give strength, to give life, berov, through hunger. Normally we know that how does one gain strength? When he eats. When we eat and we drink, that is how we get our strength. However, what is the inyan of etonis? The inyan of etonis is lahachyoisam berov. We get strength. And how do we get this strength? Through hunger. In other words, we are not eating, and we are holding out the day through rav. And the Rebbe explained it, and the Rebbe, when he explained this whole inyan, he says this is something which is so simple that even a 5-year-old child can understand it. And he says that child understands that when we eat something and we make a bracha over what we're eating, whatever category of food it may be, whether it comes from doimein, tzemeach, or chai, whether it is we eat something which grows, or a doimein, or something which had life, whatever it is, we get our chayes from that specific thing. This is what gives us strength. The child as well also understands that not only does this give us strength, it comes a time when we cannot eat, we have our strength berov through hunger. How do we get the strength? Because the child understands that we are a yid, and we possess an neshama. So the Rebishter, who gives us chayes, has told us on certain days not to eat, and still he gives us chayes on those days through hunger. As the Rebbe expressed himself, this is something which youngsters understand it very simple, and he's asking forgiveness from those over bar mitzvah who do not understand this with this same simple approach as a 5 or 6 year old child understands it in a very pure and simple way. Now the Rebbe goes a step further. The same we have when we are told regarding Shabbos and Yontif. We are told regarding Shabbos and Yontif, Ein simcha ela bebasa, ve'ein simcha ela beyayin. How do we rejoice at Shabbos? We rejoice because we eat basa shomin. In other words, a good piece of meat. And yayin yashan, which old wine. And this is something which gives an enjoyment. By this we fulfill the simcha of Shabbos. But what is the real attitude of a person when he eats this? The Rebbe says that a person has to lift himself up to a higher madrege, to such a level, that to him it's no difference whether he's drinking yayin yashan, old wine, or yayin chadash, or new wine. In other words, yayin yashan, old wine, reflects the concept of a real good and tasty wine. The same when the Chazal use the expression basar shomein, a fat piece of meat, it's also an expression of a real good piece of meat. When a Yid is fulfilling his mitzvah of enjoying his Shabbos and Yontif meal, he has to put himself into such a madrege that to him it's no difference whether he would eat a better piece of meat or a worse piece of meat. In other words, he shouldn't do it because of his gashmistic enjoyment that he's getting out of this, that he's drinking a delicious cup of wine. To him, it's no difference whether the wine is is yayin yashan or it's yayin chadash. He should be in a position where to him it's no difference. The only reason he's doing it is he's doing it because this is how the Rebbe has told us that by doing this we fulfill the wish of HaKadosh Baruch Hu of having simcha on Shabbos and having simcha on Yontif. But really, as far as he's concerned, it's no difference to him what he's eating. Why is he eating all of this? Not because he's having an enjoyment in this. He's doing this only for one simple reason. He's doing this for the reason of fulfilling the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. How is he fulfilling the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Because the Rebbe told us that this is what we have to eat on Shabbos and Yontif. But not because he's enjoying this food that he's eating Shabbos and Yontif. Not that he's having a bodily enjoyment from this. This is not the ideal way of fulfilling the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Fulfilling the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is he's eating it and he's drinking it. And what is his enjoyment? What is his satisfaction? The fact that he's fulfilling the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, in this Sikha, after the Rebbe spoke this inyan, we continue that from Parshas Tetzaveh, which we read today, we are going into Parshas Kisisa. And Parshas Kisisa begins with Kisisa as Rosh B'nai Yisrael. So it's explained in Chassidus that there is the Rosh B'nai Yisrael. What means Rosh B'nai Yisrael? The leaders of Yid. The Roshei Alpha Yisrael. What is the pshat kisisa as Rosh B'nai Yisrael? A person is capable of doing something that is sisa, that lifts up the Roshei Alpha Yisrael, that has an effect on the Nisiya Yisrael. In other words, a person's acts and deeds could have an effect and an influence on the Roshei Alpha Yisrael. Here the Rebbe brings in the Chazal. Chazal tell us that when Ma ben Talmidav shel Avraham Avinu, l'talmidav shel Bilam HaRasha, that it is possible to tell on a disciple of Avraham Avinu that he's Avraham Avinu's disciple. Same the Rebbe says. It has to be possible on a Lubavitcher Chosid to tell and recognize on his deeds and his actions. The Rebbe expressed himself on his deeds ben Adam lamokim, the way he acts ben Adam lamokim, as well as he acts ben Adam lachaveiroi, that he is a Lubavitcher Chosid. In other words, a person chassid has to act in accordance how it is befitting for a chassid. The Rebbe went in a little bit in detail and was talking about the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Rebbe always refers to the Frierdiker Rebbe as Nasi Dereinu. The Rebbe says that it was prior to the Frierdiker Rebbe's arrival here in the United States. There wasn't much of a Lubavitcher structure here. There were individuals, but it really wasn't too much of a format of a kehillah. I should use, I don't know if this was the exact term that the Rebbe used, but it was after the Rebbe came, that is when the Rebbe came and formation of Lubavitch began here with all the Lubavitch institutions and so forth. The Mela the Rebbe says, everyone has to think This is what the Rebbe has brought him over here for. In other words, are his actions in accordance to satisfy the will of the Rebbe, the wish of the Rebbe, who because of the Rebbe, we came over here to this country, and whatever we do, we always have to calculate, are our acts suitable for a Lubavitcher Chassid? In other words, are we adding satisfaction to the Rebbe by what we are doing? Again, bein Adam la Makom as well as bein Adam la Chaveroi, or Chas v'Sholom. Rebbe stressed this point very strong. But Pashut, we have to be very careful and calculate whatever we do, and make sure that whatever we do are such acts that are suitable acts and deeds for Chassidim. That is how a Chassid, how the Rebbe is a Chassid should act. As customary in the Farbrengen, that the Rebbe refers to an Inyan in the weekly Rashi, as well as in the daily Rambam. In today's Sedra, Rebbe asked a few questions. The Rebbe, with an introduction, that based on Rashi's Inyan is to always explain whatever is not understood in Pshutei Shel Mikra. This is what Rashi comes. Sometimes we have to understand the Rashi. Sometimes there are certain questions in the Psukim which are not understood, and we have to understand there's such an obvious question in the Pasuk. How is it that Rashi doesn't say anything? Especially if we look into other Mefarshim Psukim and Pashtonim, other Mefarshim that also mainly excel in being Mefarish Pshat, and they do raise questions. And why is it that Rashi does? The Rebbe began with a question at the end of today's Sedra, in other words, in today's Parsha, the Parsha of Shvi, where the Parsha begins, V'asisa Mizbeach Miktak Teiras. To make a Mizbeach, where on this Mizbeach, you will be Maktak Teiras. So the Rebbe is raising the question, what's the Pasuk? Kapitel Lamet, Pasuk Aleph, the first Pasuk after Shvi. V'asisa Mizbeach Miktar K'toiras. You shall make a Mizbeach where you shall be maktir, where you shall bring the K'toiras on that Mizbeach. And this Mizbeach should be made from Matzei Shita. The Rebbe is raising a question. We have learned already all about all the different kelim of the Beis HaMikdash. All the different things which were needed for the Mishkan, rather. And this goes back not only in this week's Sedra, but in last week's Sedra. In Parshas Truma, we have learned about all the Klei HaMikdash. Here we have learned all about the Big Kahuna. And after we have been told all of these details, now Pasuk comes at the very end and says, V'asisa Mizbeach Miktak Teiras. Why did the Torah wait so far to discuss the erection of this Mizbeach? So it raises another question. Back to the beginning of the Sedra. We begin this week's Sedra with a special commandment to Moshe Rabbeinu. Va'ata Tetzaveh b'nei Yisrael. Moshe shall command the Yidden. What should he tell them? That they should take pure oil, the proper oil which should be used for the menorah. Rabbi raises a very simple question, he asks. Rabbi says, question is a simple one. About the details of the menorah, we have already learned. We're in Parshas Truma. There the Torah does not tell us what type of oil we should use. It doesn't say anything. Now, Truma finishes, 2 psukim. What do these 2 psukim deal about? The type of oil that had to be used for the menorah. Then we go back to discuss the Big Kahuna. Why come in here with the Shem and Zayas? Obviously, it's not in its proper place to discuss about what type of oil to prepare for the menorah. And this question again is asked in Even Ezra, who is a Mefarish al pi Pshat, and he raises this question. Rashi, whose Inyan is also sticking to the realm of Pshat, does not make any mention of this question. Basically, what the Rebbe is answering is that Rashi is not getting involved in discussion what was commanded earlier, what was commanded later. There is no need for Rashi to explain these questions because Rashi is not getting involved in these questions. The Ramban raises the question. The Ramban raises a question, why were we told about the Orin first in Parshas Truma? And gives his interpretation. Rashi does not want to get involved in such an interpretation. Rashi feels that as far as understanding Pshutei Shel Mikra, it is not necessary to explain why something is told earlier or why something is told later. And the Torah is giving us a general idea of whatever is needed for the Mishkan. Now, the question arises, there are other things which were also needed for the Mishkan, and we don't find that the Torah here should tell us that we should go ahead and prepare it. Obviously, something which we talk about in every Shabbos the Kedavening. Every Shabbos. After Musaf, look into the Siddur, you'll see there's something which we have to say, V'lakachta Seilas. To take flour, that's the detail, what was put on the Shulchan. So obviously, just like the Torah tells us, but we had to prepare oil for the menorah. Why doesn't the Torah tell us that you had to prepare flour to have and to bake what to put on the shulchan? And that the Torah doesn't tell us here. Rebbe says the answer on this is a very simple one. Why? Here the Mishkan is at a planning stage. The Yidden were told everything that has to be done for the Mishkan. You have to make these kalim, these vessels, and these dishes, everything which had to be done. All the clothing which had to be made for the Kohen, for Aaron, for the Kohen Gadol, for the Kohenim. All of this the Torah tells us. The Torah also tells us that in the Mishkan there was a menorah. The menorah needed oil to light the menorah, and that is why go ahead and prepare oil. Flour, you can't go and prepare months in advance. From the discussion here till the karbanos are actually being brought, there's quite a bit of time. It took a long time. If I remember correctly, the Rebbe mentioned 6 months. Oil is something which could be prepared. To go ahead and prepare flour, this is something which is not, you needed a special oil. Furthermore, the question arises, where did the Yidden even get this oil? The Yidden were in the Midbar, so Mela, the Yidden had gold and silver they had to contribute towards the erection of the Mishkan, because this is what they took along with them from Mitzrayim. Where did they get oil? In the desert, there are no olives. So this is something which requires a preparation and requires something for them to make sure that they have it. So it's something which they could have prepared a long time in advance. To go ahead and prepare flour months in advance, the Rebbe says this is not practical. It's not practical because it wouldn't even hold fresh. So it's something which was needed for the Mishkan, but it wasn't needed for the Mishkan at this early stage when they were told what to prepare for the Mishkan. Here it wasn't needed. This is something which later they needed behemoths for karbanos, and they needed behemoths for karbanos, they needed flour for various inyanim in the Mishkan, including the Shulchan. True that in order to have the lechem upon him to put on the Shulchan, they needed the flour, but they didn't need it at this stage. That is why the Torah doesn't tell us that they should go ahead and prepare the flour.
Why is the oil at the end?
Why is the oil at the end again? Because the Rebbe is learning that the Rashi is not concerned with the Seder, with the order, the way the Torah discusses these in Yonah. First we were told about making it, about making all the various kelim, and now there's another, it's no question which in Pshutei Shel Mikra should bother us. Now the Torah tells us one of the other things which you have to prepare is also make sure that there is oil. And it doesn't have to necessarily have to be discussed together with the erection of the menorah. We are told all the things which we need for the Mishkan. And on the list of things which we need for the Mishkan is also the fact of oil. The fact why it is not discussed together with the menorah, Rashi does not hold that this is something which in Pshutei Shel Mikra we have to be concerned with. Because there is no exact Seder, there's no exact order, the way the Torah relates what has to be done for the erection of the Mishkan. The Torah tells us all of the inyanim, and that is why Rashi is not concerned why the Mizbeach HaKtoros is discussed at last, which we learn in today's Parsha, which is after Shvi in Parshas Tetzaveh. The way Rashi is learning the Seder of all the details as far as erecting the Mishkan, Rashi is not getting involved in what is discussed earlier and what is discussed later. Today's Rambam in the learning of 3 prakim a day It is in Hilchis Brachas, where the Rambam discusses that there are various brachas. There are some brachas which we are obligated min ha-Torah. There are some brachas which we are obligated min ha-Rabbanon. Very famous one which we are obligated min ha-Torah is the fact of Birchas Hamazon, benching, to bench after a meal. And in here, these halachas, the Rambam also discusses the fact of lechem mishneh, that when it comes on Shabbos, we have to have 2 chalas when we make our bracha. And the Rambam uses the expression that this is practiced on Shabbos as well as on Yom Tov. The Rebbe raises the question, Shabbos we can understand.
It's open.
Because of the man. The man, they had a double portion on Shabbos. I'm sorry, on Friday. So, they had lechem mishneh on Friday. On Shabbos, they did not get any man. So that is why, comes on Shabbos, we have a lechem mishneh. Question is, however, regarding Yom Tov. The question is really a deeper question. Did the Yidden celebrate Yom Tov in the Midbar, or didn't they? Based on what? We know it's explained in Chazal, Hasidus explains it at length, that the Yomim Tovim deal with the seasons of the year. And the seasons regarding the way the wheat and the fruit grew. Pesach is called, is in Chodesh Aviv, that's in the springtime. Then comes Shavuos. One of the other names of Shavuos is Chag HaKotzir. It's a Yom Tov when the fruit, after the fruit was, that's the season when the fruit was cut. Then comes Sukkot. Sukkot is Chag HaOsif. What means Chag HaOsif? It's the Yom Tov of gathering. That is when we gather everything into our homes. In other words, we take in everything that has grown after it was cut and bundled and packaged together. We bring it all into our home. In the Midbar, you didn't have such a situation. Furthermore, why do we celebrate Sukkot? We celebrate Sukkot because the Rebbe has protected us in the Midbar, that He's protected us and kept us in the clouds. That is why we celebrate Sukkot. Now, Rebbe is asking, could we say that the Yidden would celebrate Sukkot in the Midbar because they are within the clouds? The whole idea of celebrating Sukkot is after we were taken out of the clouds. It's a zikaron for HaKadosh Baruch Hu's nace that He did with us while we were in the Midbar all the year. But while we are in the Midbar, is there room to say, is there any grounds to say that we will celebrate Sukkot because the Rebbe is protecting us now in clouds? It's not a zikaron, there's no zikaron there. That is the living conditions which we are living under in the Midbar. So this whole halach and the Rambam, that we take lechem mishneh not only on Shabbos but on Yom Tov, needs an explanation. So the Rebbe is learning that Yom Tov has another inyan in it. Yom Tov has an inyan of Mikra Kodesh. What is the inyan of Mikra Kodesh? Mikra Kodesh means it brings sanctity, it brings Kedusha. And this is something from this, in other words, Yom Tov has many inyanim within it. In fact, interesting, when he was talking about the fact how the Yidden were protected in the cloud, he mentioned that we know of situations that Yidden would go out of the cloud. We know that the Yidden would be, it's mentioned in Chazal that there were merchants that would travel the Midbar in those times. They would bring in certain goods, certain items to sell, and they would the Yidden would go out and meet these individuals, and they would purchase it from them. So we do find situations where individuals will be going out of the clouds on certain times and certain occasions. But in general, the Yidden went on for all the years being protected by the clouds. Getting back to the Teretz, the Teretz is the way the Rebbe explains the inyan of a Yom Tov is Mikra Kodesh. Mikra Kodesh means to create Kedusha, to call for Kedusha, to call for sanctity. This prat in the Yom Tov, this was always there. So Mamela, the Rebishter told us that we have to proclaim these Yomim Tovim, and proclaim these Yomim Tovim that we should observe them. So now, later years, there were additional inyanim in the Yomim Tovim. Until then, the fact that Yontif has this inyan of Mikra Kodesh within it, a call for Kedusha, we create special, the Rebishter gave over to Yidden a koyach that they should put Kedusha into these days, and these are the special days of the Yomim Tovim. Memela, it is in these days that we treat them just like we treat Shabbos, which Shabbos is a day of Kedusha. And Shabbos, we know that we have Lechem Mishneh. We make a bracha, we make it always over 2 chalas, 2 matzahs, whatever the situation may be. The same thing when we're talking on Yontif, it is also the same. And this is how we see from the Rambam, that the Rambam tells us that Lechem Mishneh is used on Shabbos as well as on Yontif. The end of the Farbrengen, Rabbi said that even though it is Shabbos, still it is a proper time to remind on all of the inyanim that have a shaychus to Purim, the inyanim of Mivtza Purim, and on Shabbos we can even learn and prepare ourselves for Purim. In other words, by learning halachas of Purim and learning inyanim that have a shaychus to Purim, especially inyanim that have a shaychus to Motzei Shabbos and to tomorrow, which is the inyan of Mivtza Purim, to see to it that every Yid hears the Megillah, gives Mishloach Mones, fulfills the mitzvahs of Purim, which is hearing the Megillah, Mishloach Mones, and Matanos Lav Yoinim. Rabbi added on that there's a mitzvah in Purim which can be fulfilled every minute of the day. And that is the mitzvah of Simcha. All the other mitzvahs, there's the time when we fulfill the mitzvah. We listen to the Megillah, or we read the Megillah. We give Matanos Lav Yoinim. We give Mishloach Mones. However, the mitzvah of Simcha is such which we have to fulfill every moment of the day of Purim. It is brought that not only by Purim, but as soon as we enter the month of Adar, we have to rejoice and add simcha, add on simcha. How much more so is it when not only are we at the level of Mishanichnas Adar, but we are at the level of the day of Purim itself, that we constantly have to fulfill this mitzvah of simcha, and the mitzvah of simcha is a constant mitzvah for the entire day of Purim, that the entire day of Purim we have to be besimcha.